What if everything you learned in history class was missing a chapter? Not a small chapter, an entire civilization, one that spanned millions of square miles, built structures so advanced we still cannot fully explain them today, and was somehow scrubbed from every official record within a single generation. What if that civilization was not ancient Rome, not Egypt, not Babylon? What if it was gone just 200 years ago? And what if the people who erased it are still celebrated as heroes in your history books today? Welcome to the mystery of Tartaria, and today we are going to find out who destroyed it. Stay until the end, because theory number 3 is going to change the way you see every city you have ever lived in. Before we talk about who destroyed Tartaria, we need to understand what it was, because if you have never heard of it, that is exactly the point. Pull up any world map from the 1700s, not a digital reproduction, an original, something printed before 1800, and look at the center of the map, stretching from Eastern Europe all the way across Russia, across Central Asia, covering what we now call Siberia, Mongolia, and vast territories of the north. You will see a name written in large letters across the continent. Tartaria. Not a small kingdom, not a tribal region. On many of these maps, Tartaria is labeled as the largest nation on Earth, bigger than any empire that officially exists in that period, bigger than the British Empire at its peak. It covers roughly a third of the entire landmass of the planet. And yet, go to any school, open any textbook, ask any history professor, Tartaria is described as nothing more than a vague geographic term, a medieval placeholder, a way cartographers described the unknown East. But here is the problem with that explanation. You do not write the name of a geographic placeholder in the same font as the names of real countries. You do not draw borders around a myth, and you do not list population figures, trade routes, and capital cities for a region that supposedly does not exist. On those old maps, Tartaria has all of those things. So something happened, something that took a civilization present on official European maps in the 1700s and turned it into a footnote that historians barely acknowledge today. The question is not did something happen. The evidence for that is sitting in plain sight in libraries and museums all over the world. The question is what happened, and who made it happen. There are 3 main theories. They are very different from each other, and we are not going to tell you which one is right, because honestly, we do not think anyone can say for certain yet. What we are going to do is lay them out as fairly as we can, and let you make up your own mind. Let us start with the most accepted explanation, the one that the academic world would be most comfortable with, and then we will go deeper. Theory 1, the Romanov Empire absorbed and renamed it. The first theory says that Tartaria was not destroyed in any dramatic sense. It was conquered, absorbed, and then deliberately renamed and rewritten out of the historical record by the expanding Russian Empire under the Romanov dynasty. Here is the historical timeline that supports this view. Between roughly 1600 and 1800, the Romanovs embarked on one of the most aggressive territorial expansions in human history. They pushed east with extraordinary speed, subduing tribe after tribe, kingdom after kingdom, and annexing territories across Siberia and Central Asia at a pace that still staggers historians today. What the proponents of this theory argue is that the entity we see labeled as Tartaria on those old maps was not a unified empire with a single capital and a single ruler in the traditional Western sense. It was a loose confederation of Turkic, Mongol, and Slavic peoples united by culture, trade networks, and shared governance structures that simply did not fit the European model of a nation-state. And when the Romanovs consumed it, they did not just take the land. They took the administrative records, the naming rights, and most importantly, they took control of how the story would be told. Peter the Great is central to this theory. He famously westernized Russia. He reformed the alphabet. He moved the capital. He invited Western European scholars to rewrite Russian history according to European standards. And what those scholars produced was a historical record that began Russian civilization with the Kievan Rus and skipped lightly over what had existed in the vast territories to the east before the Romanov conquest. Supporters of this theory point to the fact that the word Tartaria disappears from maps almost exactly in sync with the period of Russian imperial consolidation. By the mid-1800s, it is gone entirely. The timing is not a coincidence, they argue. It is a paper trail. This theory is uncomfortable for mainstream historians, not because it is impossible, but because it implies that the rewriting of history was intentional, that it was a policy decision made at the highest levels of one of history's most powerful empires. And that is a much bigger claim than saying an obscure geographic term simply fell out of use. But even this theory, the most conservative of the 3, raises a question that no one has fully answered. If Tartaria was just a loose collection of unorganized tribes, Why do its buildings keep turning up? Theory 2, a catastrophic event buried in advanced civilization. Theory 2 is where things get genuinely strange, and the reason it has captured millions of people online is not because it is fringe. It is because the physical evidence people cite for it is real, documented, and has never been given a satisfactory official explanation. This theory starts with buildings. Walk through the oldest districts of cities across Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. Look at the ground floors. In city after city, you will find structures where the first floor windows are half buried, where doorways open into what should be basements, where ornate facades decorated with incredibly sophisticated stonework sit partially underground, as if the earth rose up around them. The official explanation for this is gradual accumulation. Cities build up over centuries as debris, garbage, and construction raises the street level. It happens everywhere. London is built on many layers. Rome is built on Rome. But the people who study this phenomenon, and there are now thousands of them comparing photographs from cities across the former Tartarian territory, point out that the burial pattern looks less like gradual accumulation and more like a single catastrophic event. The mud line, as researchers call it, appears to be consistent across vast geographic distances, not a slow rise over decades, a single sudden deposit. And then there are the buildings themselves. Some of the half-buried structures in what was Tartarian territory display architectural details that do not match the supposed technological capability of their claimed construction date. Precision stonework, complex acoustic and geometric design principles built into the foundations, heating and ventilation systems that predated their supposed invention by a century or more. The mud flood theory suggests that sometime in the late 1700s or early 1800s, a catastrophic geological or atmospheric event, possibly linked to a comet impact, a massive seismic event, or a phenomenon related to what scientists call a grand solar minimum, buried a significant portion of the Tartarian civilization under meters of sediment almost instantly. The survivors were left in a world where the civilization that had produced these structures was gone, and the new powers filling that vacuum had every reason to take credit for the buildings still standing and erase the memory of who actually built them. What makes this theory hard to dismiss outright is that the early 1800s are full of documented anomalies. There are records of famine conditions across the northern hemisphere, accounts of years without summer, a documented global temperature drop that agricultural records and harvest data confirm independently. Something happened to the climate around that period. The debate is what? Proponents of the mud flood theory argue that the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, currently cited as the official cause of the year without a summer, was not large enough to produce the scale of disruption recorded in contemporary accounts. They believe the climate evidence points to something bigger, something that mainstream geology has not fully grappled with. This theory does not require malice to explain the disappearance of Tartaria from the historical record. It just requires what always follows catastrophe, the winners writing the story of what came before. Theory 3, a global power structure engineered the erasure. This is the theory that is going to make some of you uncomfortable, not because it requires extraordinary claims about ancient aliens or supernatural events, but because if it is true, it has direct implications for the world you are living in right now. Theory 3 starts with a question. What if Tartaria was not just geographically large? What if it was technologically advanced? What if it had developed energy systems, infrastructure, and social organization that represented a fundamentally different model of civilization from the one that replaced it? And what if the powers that destroyed it did so not by accident, not by natural disaster, but by deliberate and coordinated military and political action, because that civilization represented a threat to a new world order being built around centralized control of energy, money, and information? The evidence that proponents of this theory point to begins with the buildings that the mud flood theorists identified, but takes a different conclusion from them. In cities across the world, not just in former Tartarian territory, there are structures from the 19th century that researchers argue could not have been built by the people who supposedly built them with the technology they supposedly had. The speed of construction alone is difficult to account for. The precision of the stonework requires tools and techniques that were supposedly not invented yet. And the sheer scale of these projects, many of them completed in years rather than decades, strains the logistical limits of what horse-drawn carts and hand-mixed mortar can achieve. But here is where Theory 3 goes further than Theory 2. It says this is not just a question of lost technology. It says the free energy research of Nikola Tesla, the man who claimed he could pull unlimited electrical power from the air itself, was not a new discovery. It was a rediscovery. that the domed and spired buildings found across the old Tartarian maps were not decorative, they were functional. They were receivers and transmitters for a global energy grid that the civilization had developed, and that the people who replaced it had every financial reason to destroy. Tesla himself said things that are striking in this context. He spoke of energy that existed freely in the environment. He was funded and then defunded and then methodically discredited by the people who had built their fortunes on oil, coal, and centralized power generation. His laboratory was burned to the ground. His research was seized by the government upon his death. And the model of the world he was trying to build, where energy was free and decentralized, was replaced by the model we live in today, where energy is expensive, centrally controlled, and owned by some of the most powerful entities on Earth. Theory 3 says the destruction of Tartaria and the suppression of Tesla's work are the same story told 200 years apart. That somewhere between 1780 and 1880, a deliberate reset of global civilization took place. That a world with free energy, distributed governance, and cultural continuity stretching back thousands of years was systematically dismantled and replaced with the centralized, debt-based, fossil fuel-dependent system we inherited. And that the people who engineered that reset wrote the history books, founded the universities, and built the institutions that still control what we are allowed to know about the past. The most striking piece of evidence this theory points to is the world's fairs. The enormous exhibitions held in cities across America and Europe in the late 1800s and early 1900s, where astonishing buildings were constructed seemingly overnight, displayed to millions of visitors, and then demolished immediately after. Buildings of extraordinary size, precision, and beauty, built and destroyed, no surviving record of their construction, no blueprints. No detailed workforce documentation. Official history says they were temporary structures made of plaster and wood, built by large crews in a short time and demolished because they were never meant to last. But critics of that explanation point to photographs of these structures showing stonework, column detailing, and surface weathering patterns that are inconsistent with newly built plaster facades. They look like real buildings, ancient buildings, and they look like the buildings we see partially buried in the former territories of Tartaria. Theory 3 says the world's fairs were not exhibitions, they were the final liquidation, the last public display of an inherited built environment before it was destroyed, the land cleared, and new cities constructed on top of the old foundations according to the new order's specifications. A civilization was not just conquered, it was processed, its buildings repurposed or demolished, its history rewritten. Its people absorbed into a new narrative that began with the people who had just finished erasing them. And the orphan trains documented historical fact, thousands of children with no known parents transporting across America in the same decades as the world's fairs, are cited by Theory 3 as the human side of this reset. A generation unmoored from its origins, placed into new families, new identities, new stories. No past, no inheritance, no memory of what their world had looked like before. Now here is where we leave the three theories and ask you directly. Look at the world you live in, not the one in the textbooks, the actual physical world around you. Why do so many government buildings, train stations, and courthouses built supposedly in the 1800s have a scale and grandeur that modern construction, with all our machinery and technology, struggles to replicate or even afford? Why do the oldest buildings in cities across the former Tartarian territory sit lower than the street, as if the ground swallowed them? Why does a civilization large enough to appear on every major map of the 1700s not have a museum, not have a national day, not have a chapter in a single mainstream history curriculum anywhere on Earth? Why is the first instinct of the academic establishment, when confronted with these questions, not curiosity but ridicule? We are not here to give you answers. We are here to give you questions worth asking, because the moment you start pulling on this thread, you realize it connects to almost every other suppressed history conversation happening right now. The conversation about lost ancient technology, the conversation about who controls energy, the conversation about how civilizations end and who decides what gets remembered afterward. Tartaria may or may not have been what the most passionate researchers claim it was, but the fact that it was on the maps and is not in the history books is not a small thing. That gap deserves an honest answer, and so far, no one in a position of official authority has bothered to give one. So we will ask again, who destroyed Tartaria? Was it the Romanovs, expanding their empire and rewriting the story of everything they consumed? Was it a catastrophic natural event that ended a civilization overnight and left the survivors without a record of what came before? Or was it something more deliberate, a coordinated reset by the people who understood that controlling the past is the most powerful way to control the future? Tell us in the comments which theory you believe, and tell us why, because this conversation does not end here. This is just the beginning. If this video made you think, share it with one person who asks questions, not because we told you to, because the people who erased Tartaria were counting on you not to. We will see you in the next one.